Jimi Hendrix, a man considered a god, admitted there was someone better. That man was Terry Kath. So how did this guitar god die? Not in a legendary battle on stage, not from an overdose in a glamorous hotel. He killed himself with a stupid joke, with a smile on his face and a single bullet from a gun he thought was empty. That single gunshot was an act of cosmic irony. It did not forge a legend, it created a footnote. It did not immortalize a god, it erased him. This is the story of how one moment of stupidity can annihilate a lifetime of genius. The story of Terry Kath, the guitar god who pulled the trigger that erased his own name from history. When Terry Allen Kath was born on January 31st, 1946, the world was still catching its breath. Only months had passed since the end of World War II, and America was just beginning to shift from war footing to the promise of peace. In the city of Chicago, this new energy was electric. It was a city of steel, stockyards, and stark contrasts, a place where ambition and grit were currency. Terry's Chicago of youth was a city of two distinct musical minds, a sonic Mason-Dixon line dividing the old from the new. Downtown, in the sophisticated supper clubs, the polished arrangements of swing still held sway. But a few miles south, a revolution was brewing. In the cramped studio of Chess Records at 2120 South Michigan Avenue, a sound was being forged that was raw and primal. It was the sound of the Great Migration, the sound of rural Southern blues electrified and amplified for a new urban reality. Artists like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf were creating a musical language of raw power and undisguised emotion. Young Terry Kath grew up squarely in the middle of this seismic collision of cultures. He was a child of the radio age, twisting the dial, his mind absorbing everything the airwaves threw at him. He was mesmerized by the thunderous drum solos of his hometown hero, Gene Krupa, but he was equally captivated by the nascent, rebellious energy of early rock and roll. The Kath household was not a quiet one. Music wasn't just a hobby, it was a language. His father Raymond was a man of his time, a hard-working employee at the Standard Oil Company who understood the value of a steady paycheck. But by night, he shed his workaday skin to indulge his passion, singing jazz standards. His mother, Evelyn, was a musical force in her own right, playing banjo and singing opera. From a young age, Terry was the designated musician of the family. He started on drums at 5, but at the age of 9, he found his true voice. He received a cheap Epiphone acoustic guitar for Christmas. It wasn't a fancy instrument, but to him, it was everything. His musical education was unconventional. There were no formal lessons. His classroom was the living room floor, his teachers the disembodied voices from the radio and the spinning vinyl. He learned the complex chords of jazz from his father, but his soul was set on fire by something new and rebellious. He was captivated by the raw energy of early rock and roll and the clean, reverb-drenched twang of surf guitarists like the Ventures. This self-taught, play-by-ear approach was crucial. It meant he wasn't bound by the rules of traditional music theory. He was part of the first generation of American rockers who weren't trying to imitate the old guard. They were inventing a new language in real time, and Terry Kath was becoming one of its most fluent speakers. But even within this musical sanctuary, a quiet conflict was brewing. Raymond, for all his love of music, saw it as a pastime, not a profession. He was a product of the Great Depression, a man who understood the precariousness of life and the supreme value of security. He wanted his eldest son to follow a safe, respectable path, college, a degree, an office career with a pension. This clash between blue-collar expectations and a burning artistic passion became the central, unspoken tension of Terry's young life. He was a sensitive soul, a fact that contrasted with his large, imposing physical frame. According to his daughter's 2016 documentary, The Terry Kath Experience, he was often bullied at school for his singular focus. The other kids didn't understand. The guitar wasn't just a passion, it was a refuge. Behind the tough working-class Chicago exterior, he learned to project there was a vulnerable artist who communicated best not with words, but with 6 strings. By the time he entered Taft High School, the guitar was no longer a hobby. It was an obsession, an extension of his own body. At the age of 14, in 1960, he formed his first band, the Mystics. They were a cover band, cutting their teeth in the smoky, beer-soaked bars and VFW halls of Chicago. Playing in these clubs was a harsh but invaluable education. Even then, the seeds of his future artistic conflicts were being sown. While the bandmates were content to play the commercial pop hits, Terry was constantly pushing for more. He wanted to stretch out, to improvise, to inject the raw, primal wail of the blues into their set list. The rock and roll purist, the artist who valued expression over entertainment, was already at odds with the commercial demands of the music business. This dedication came at a steep price. The late-night gigs and all-consuming focus on music took a heavy toll on his schoolwork. His grades plummeted. By the mid-1960s, music had completely taken over his life. After finishing high school, he decided to skip college and dedicate himself fully to the guitar. For his family, it was a devastating blow. For Terry, it was the point of no return. He had willingly slammed the door on a conventional life. There was no safety net, no plan B. It was music or nothing. The pressure was immense, but it was also liberating. The door to an office job had closed, but another one, leading to the stages and stadiums of the world, was just beginning to creak open. But before Terry Kath could step through that open door, he would be unceremoniously knocked to the ground. Yet, it was in the humiliation of this professional failure that the true foundation for his masterpiece would be laid. He was about to enter the crucible. In 1966, the precarious floor of a working musician's life fell out from under him. In a cold maneuver, Terry Kath, Walter Perezider, and Danny Serafine were fired from the band Jimmy Ford and the executives. The rejection was a profound and humiliating blow. It forced him to do the one thing he had fought so hard to avoid. He took a temporary office job. That brief job was a descent into his personal hell. Sitting under the sterile fluorescent lights, he was living his father's dream and his own waking nightmare. The rhythmic clatter of typewriters and the monotonous drone of office machinery were a torturous symphony of conformity. Each tick of the clock was not measuring time. It was measuring the silence where his music should have been. The ghost of his father's "I told you so" must have haunted every waking moment. Was his father right all along? Was he just a foolish kid with a guitar, destined for failure? The humiliation of being fired, of being told he wasn't good enough, gnawed at his self-confidence. However, this experience did not break him. Instead, it forged him. Deep within, Terry Kath was a core of pure, unadulterated Chicago toughness. In the suffocating silence of that office, a quiet, cold fury began to build. The humiliation curdled into defiance. The despair was transmuted into a white-hot resolve. He, Walter, and Danny had been cast aside. The experience lit a fire under them. They were done playing by other people's rules. They would build something of their own, something new, something that had never been heard before. The sanctuary during this bleak period was the basement of Walter Perezider's parents' house. It was their war room. Here, they licked their wounds and plotted their revenge. The idea when it came was Walter's. He proposed, what if we created a rock and roll band with a horn section? And I don't mean a horn section that just plays little punctuation parts in the background. I mean a horn section that is a co-lead instrument, a section that can trade solos with the guitar and hit with the same power as a full-on rock band. For Terry, it was a revelation. His entire musical life had been a balancing act between the raw gut-bucket blues and rock he loved and the sophisticated jazz harmonies he had absorbed from his father. This idea wasn't a compromise between those two worlds. It was a collision. It was ambitious. It was difficult. And to their knowledge, no one had ever truly pulled it off before. They were not entirely alone in this thinking. On the West Coast, musicians like Mike Bloomfield were forming the Electric Flag, and in New York, Al Kooper was assembling Blood, Sweat, and Tears. The idea of fusing rock with brass was in the air, but the vision taking shape in Parasite's basement was different. Where other bands often used horns to add a touch of jazz or soul flavoring, the Chicago vision was more aggressive, more integrated. They envisioned a true collision where the guitar and horns would be equal partners in a powerful, gritty sonic assault. This ambition was a direct reflection of the turbulent times. The late 1960s in America was a pressure cooker of social upheaval, countercultural rebellion, and anti-war sentiment. That spirit of defiance, of wanting to break the rules and create something new and loud, infused their early sessions. They weren't just creating a new sound, they were building a soundtrack for a generation on edge. With this audacious vision, they began their search for the right musicians. Their first recruit was James Pankow, a trombone player and a brilliant arranger. Next came Lee Loughnane, a trumpeter. The crucial piece was Robert Lamb, a gifted keyboardist and a sophisticated songwriter. They called themselves the Big Thing, and in that basement, they began the painstaking work of fusing these disparate elements together. During this formative period, Terry's role as the band's musical soul became undeniable. While Lamb and Pankow were often the primary composers, Terry was the anchor. He was the street in their sound. His raw, blues-drenched guitar playing and his earthy voice were the foundation that kept the band from flying off into the abstract realms of jazz fusion. He grounded them. For Terry, this was profoundly validating. After the humiliation of being fired, he was now the undisputed heart of a band filled with conservatory-trained musicians who looked to him for authenticity. This wasn't just his band, it was his vindication. For the first time, he felt like he was in control of his own musical destiny. The Big Thing was developing a sound that was turning heads all over Chicago, but they were missing one crucial element, a true lead voice that could soar over their complex arrangements. In late 1967, they found him in a rival band. His name was Peter Cetera. Cetera was everything they weren't. He was a charismatic performer with matinee idol good looks and a jaw-droppingly high tenor voice. His voice, clear and pure as a bell, was the perfect commercial counterpoint to Terry's gritty, soulful baritone. When Cetera joined, singing and playing bass, allowing Terry to focus exclusively on guitar, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Their growing reputation soon caught the ear of James William Guercio. Guercio was a producer and manager who had already made a name for himself. He saw the Big Thing and immediately recognized their potential. He became their champion, their mentor, their Svengali. He suggested a new name, Chicago Transit Authority, a name that was gritty, urban, and rooted them firmly in the identity of their hometown. And he convinced them that if they wanted to make it big, they had to leave Chicago. They had to go to Los Angeles. The arrival of Guercio was the beginning of the central conflict of Terry's professional life, the battle between art and commerce. In Guercio, Terry saw both a savior and a threat. On one hand, Guercio was their ticket to the big time. On the other, Terry was deeply wary of the commercial pressures. Guercio didn't just want to record their music. He wanted to shape it, package it, sell it. He wanted hits. For Terry, whose music was an unfiltered expression of his soul, the idea of tailoring it for radio play felt like a betrayal. The decision to move to Los Angeles in 1968 was monumental. It came at a significant personal cost. He had to leave behind his family from a short-lived first marriage. The weight of this decision, the guilt of pursuing his dream at the expense of his personal responsibilities, was a heavy burden. As the band packed their lives into a van and headed west toward the promise of fame and fortune, Terry Kath sat in the passenger seat, a silent warrior carrying the weight of his city, his family, and his own artistic soul into the unknown. With the band assembled and the vision clear, Terry Kath had escaped his past. Now arriving in the sun-bleached jungle of Los Angeles, he and his band of Chicago brothers faced a new and more daunting challenge: conquering the future. The ascent was about to begin. The U-Haul truck carrying their lives and their ambitions rolled into Los Angeles in 1968, leaving the familiar gritty skyline of Chicago behind for the sprawling, sun-bleached promises of Southern California. They were no longer the big thing, a local curiosity. They were Chicago Transit Authority, James William Guercio's new project, and the pressure was immediate and immense. For Terry Kath, the sense of dislocation was profound. This wasn't just a new city. It was a new reality, one that would test his spirit and his artistry in ways he could never have imagined. Their first home in L.A. was a small house Guercio had rented for them, a cramped space where 7 ambitious musicians were piled on top of each other. The glamour of Hollywood was a world away. Their days were a monotonous cycle of grueling 10-hour rehearsals in a stuffy room. The nights were spent prowling the legendary clubs of the Sunset Strip, the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Troubadour. It was here that the scale of their ambition came into sharp focus. They were no longer the hot new band from Chicago. They were small fish in a vast shark-infested ocean. On any given night, they could see bands like The Doors or Led Zeppelin command the stage. The level of talent was staggering, the competition terrifying. For Terry, this environment was both intimidating and invigorating. He was a Chicagoan to the bone, and he carried the city's blue-collar chip on his shoulder like a badge of honor. He saw the preening rock gods of the Sunset Strip and felt a mixture of awe and disdain. This feeling of being an outsider became his armor. In his mind, it was us against them, 7 guys from Chicago against the entire Los Angeles machine. This mentality fueled an intense, almost maniacal work ethic. He poured all of his homesickness, his anxiety, and his defiant spirit into his instrument. The fretboard of his Fender Telecaster became the battlefield where he would fight for his band's survival and his own artistic soul. Every note he played was infused with a desperate urgency to prove he belonged, not by fitting in, but by standing out. In January 1969, they entered CBS Studios in Hollywood to record their debut album. In an act of either supreme confidence or stunning arrogance, they didn't just record enough material for one album, they recorded enough for 2. A double album for a debut was unheard of, a massive commercial risk. The album, released in April 1969, was a sprawling, eclectic, and audacious statement. The opening track, Introduction, was Terry Kath's 6.5-minute mission statement. Written and sung by him, his soulful, commanding baritone led the charge, culminating in a blistering, fuzzed-out guitar solo that announced the arrival of a major, new talent. What made Kath's playing so revered was its unique blend of raw power and sophisticated intelligence. In an era where guitarists were increasingly reliant on a battery of effects pedals, Kath was a purist. His signature tone came from plugging his heavily customized Fender Telecaster, which he affectionately called a Telebastard, directly into his amplifier and turning it up to the breaking point. This created a sound that was incredibly honest and dynamic. Every nuance came directly from his fingers. His style was a paradox. His rhythm playing was tight, funky, and percussively precise. Yet his solos were wild, melodic, and full of long lyrical phrases that owed more to a jazz saxophonist than a traditional rock guitarist. He lacked the psychedelic chaos of Hendrix and the rigid blues traditionalism of Clapton. Instead, he forged a third path, one defined by soulful expression and an untamed visceral energy. But the album's most radical, polarizing, and personal moment was a track buried on side 3, Free Form Guitar. For nearly 7 minutes, with no backing from the band, Terry created an astonishing symphony of pure sound. It wasn't a song, it was an event. Using a Fender Stratocaster plugged directly into an amplifier, he conjured a soundscape of feedback, distortion, and dive-bombing whammy bar effects. It was a single-take improvisation that sounded like a cross between a Jimi Hendrix solo and experimental electronic music. Free-form guitar cannot be overstated as a window into Terry Kath's soul. It was a pure, unfiltered broadcast of his internal state. In a band that was increasingly about tight arrangements and complex charts, this was his declaration of freedom. It was a primal scream. It was the sound of his anxieties about Los Angeles, his frustration with commercial demands, and his raw, untamable musical spirit, all unleashed in one explosive torrent of noise. It was his declaration of war against the very machine that was creating him, a 7-minute primal scream to remind them that the soul they were trying to package was, and always would be, wild. For many listeners, it was unlistenable. For a select few, it was the sound of genius. For Terry, it was the honest truth. To truly grasp Kath's genius, one must dissect the architecture of his sound. And there is no better blueprint than the band's iconic hit, 25 or 6 to 4. The song is a masterclass in his power. The opening riff is not just a memorable hook, it is an assault, a percussive, aggressive statement of intent. He then introduces the wah-wah pedal, not as a gimmicky effect, but as a second voice, a melodic counterpoint that talks and cries between the lyrical phrases. The solo itself is a perfectly constructed narrative. It begins with a burst of furious, high-speed blues licks, transitions into a melodic, soaring passage that showcases his improvisational brilliance and culminates in a controlled chaos of feedback and distortion. It is the sound of a musician playing with fire, yet never getting burned. This virtuosity did not go unnoticed by his peers. Joe Walsh, a close friend and a legendary guitarist in his own right, recalled his friend's talent with awe. He was a great guitar player. He was a lead singer, a lead guitar player, and a rhythm guitar player all at once. Walsh noted that Kath's right-hand technique was so powerful and rhythmically complex that he made one guitar sound like 3. This unique sound was channeled through a unique weapon. His Telebastard was no off-the-shelf instrument. It was a reflection of his sonic vision. He replaced the standard single-coil Telecaster bridge pickup with a powerful Gibson humbucker, giving him the ability to create thick, distorted rock tones while retaining the snappy clarity of the Fender neck pickup. He even reversed the control plate, placing the volume knob at the front for easy access to the subtle volume swells that were a hallmark of his dynamic control. This was not just a player. This was a sonic architect, a man who built his tools to match the revolutionary sounds in his head. Chicago Transit Authority was not an immediate smash hit, but it found a home on the burgeoning world of FM radio. The band hit the road, touring relentlessly and building a devoted following. Just as momentum was building, two significant events occurred. First, the actual Chicago Transit Authority threatened a lawsuit, forcing them to shorten their name to the leaner, more iconic Chicago. Second, they missed the single most important cultural event of their generation. Guitarist had booked them to play the Woodstock Music and Art Fair in August 1969. However, in a calculated business decision related to a feud with promoter Bill Graham, Guitarist pulled Chicago from Woodstock at the last minute. Their slot was given to a then lesser-known band called Santana, whose electrifying performance launched them into superstardom. For the band, and particularly for Terry, missing Woodstock was a soul-crushing blow. This wasn't just another gig. It was history. To have that opportunity snatched away because of a backstage business squabble was infuriating. For Terry, it was the ultimate confirmation of his deepest suspicions. The business always got in the way of the music. He had sacrificed everything to be a musician, and at his generation's defining musical moment, he was forced to sit on the sidelines because of a manager's chess move. The bitterness of that missed opportunity would linger for years. Despite the Woodstock setback, their relentless touring paid off. In 1970, they released Chicago, another ambitious double album, which would become their breakthrough. It was on this record that the world discovered another side of Terry Kath. James Pankow had composed an ambitious suite of songs, and the emotional centerpiece was Make Me Smile. Guitarist assigned the lead vocal to Terry. His performance was a revelation, sung with a raw, desperate emotion. The album also contained a gentle ballad called Color My World. Again, Terry was given the lead vocal. He delivered the lines with a quiet, breathy intimacy that was startlingly tender. It was a voice full of warmth and vulnerability, the sound of a tough Chicago kid letting his guard down completely. And that staggering success would change everything, creating a profound internal duality for the reluctant star. He was no longer just an innovative guitar hero. He was the voice behind massive pop hits. He never considered himself a singer in the technical sense, not like Peter Cetera. He once said, "I'm not a singer, I'm a guitarist who sings." To suddenly be celebrated for this quiet, tender side was disconcerting. He was a rock and roll animal who lived for the explosive energy of a live guitar solo, yet millions of people now knew him for a gentle ballad. He was proud of the success, but he was uncomfortable with the pop star label it brought. He was now expected to be both the band's untamed soul and its tender heart, a contradiction he would struggle to reconcile for the rest of his life. From 1971 to 1975, Chicago was unstoppable. They were one of the biggest bands in the world, releasing a string of multi-platinum #1 albums. Chicago 3, Chicago 5, Chicago 6, Chicago 7. They sold out arenas and stadiums across the globe. But this incredible success came at a terrible cost. The band was trapped in the relentless record tour cycle. To combat the crushing monotony of the road, Kath appointed himself the band's court jester and master prankster. His elaborate practical jokes were legendary, a desperate attempt to inject laughter into the sterile cycle of hotels and arenas. But this role as the fun-loving big brother was a performance in itself, a mask for the turmoil brewing within. The louder he made others laugh, the more he struggled to quiet the unhappiness inside him. This struggle wasn't just personal. It was amplified by the surreal duality of life on tour. On stage, they were an invincible musical force. Off stage, they were 7 lonely men scattered in anonymous hotel rooms, and in that crushing silence, Terry's demons found room to grow. Life became a sterile sequence of anonymous hotel rooms, stale airplane cabins, and backstage waiting areas. As Danny Serafine wrote in his book Street Player, the endless downtime and lack of normalcy were spiritually corrosive. The brotherhood that existed on stage was often fractured behind the scenes by exhaustion, competing egos, and the sheer pressure of being a multi-million-dollar corporation. The roar of the crowd was a powerful drug, but the silence that followed was a crushing void. It was in this void that Terry's demons found room to grow, and the excesses of the lifestyle became the only available medicine to fill the emptiness. To understand the internal pressures tearing Terry apart, one must first understand the complex ecosystem of the band itself. At its core was the powerful bond between Terry and drummer Danny Serafine. They were the engine room, the street-tough rhythm section, that gave the conservatory-trained horn players their foundation of raw power. Their connection was almost telepathic on stage, a friendship forged in rhythm and cemented by endless practical jokes on the road. For Serafine, watching Terry's decline was not just losing a bandmate, it was losing a brother, the other half of the band's beating heart. The relationship with the band's primary composers, Robert Lamb and James Pankow, was one of mutual respect but also creative tension. As formally trained musicians, they were the architects crafting the complex arrangements that define Chicago's sound. They looked to Terry for the raw, improvisational fire, the authentic blues grit that they, in their own words, did not possess. He was their anchor to the blues, their guarantee of authenticity. Yet as their compositions grew more sophisticated, the space for Terry's raw expression began to shrink. The most complex dynamic, however, was with Peter Cetera. It was not a relationship of animosity, but of polar artistic opposition. They respected each other's immense talents, but they were fundamentally different artists. Cetera was the golden-voiced pop craftsman, a master of the ballad with a keen sense of commercial appeal. Terry was the gritty, soulful blues warrior. When Cetera joined, it completed the band, but it also planted the seeds of its central conflict. Every hit ballad that Cetera sang pushed the band further into the commercial territory that Terry, the band's founding soul, fundamentally distrusted. Because for Terry, this golden era truly was a gilded cage. The success he had dreamed of in that soul-crushing office job had been achieved, but it didn't bring the peace he craved. Instead, it brought a new kind of prison. The relentless grind was creatively and spiritually draining. The musical purist in him felt increasingly alienated. The band he had co-founded as a radical experiment was now a hit-making machine, and he was a crucial cog within it. The stage, once his place of ultimate freedom, was becoming a place of expectation. The boy from Norwood Park who just wanted to play the blues with honesty was now a global superstar, a product to be managed and marketed. He was trapped by the very success he had helped create. The internal conflict that had defined his life, art versus commerce, authenticity versus expectation, was now playing out on a global stage, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. To cope, he began to seek refuge in the dangerous excesses the rock and roll lifestyle offered in abundance. The ascent was over. The long, slow, tragic descent was about to begin. Before the descent began, it is essential to understand the sheer magnitude of the talent that was at risk. Terry Kath was not just a great guitarist, he was a sonic innovator, a man who built his sound from the ground up with instinct, intelligence, and raw power. His primary weapon was his collection of Fender guitars, most notably a Telecaster so heavily modified with different pickups, custom paint, and stickers that he lovingly called it the Telebastard. But the true secret to his tone was its purity. In an era where many of his peers were beginning to rely on a growing arsenal of effects pedals, Kath's philosophy was minimalist. For much of his peak, his signal chain was brutally simple: guitar, chord, amplifier. His explosive, distorted sound came from the natural overdrive of a cranked-up tube amp, controlled with masterful precision by the volume knob on his guitar. This gave his playing an unparalleled dynamic range. He could go from a clean whisper to a roaring scream simply with a flick of his wrist. It was an honest sound, with nowhere to hide, where every emotional nuance from his hands was transferred directly to the speaker. His voice was an instrument of similar honesty. It was a raw, soulful baritone that stood in stark contrast to the technically polished tenors of the era. It lacked formal training, but it possessed something far more valuable: character. You can hear three different singers in one man: the aggressive blues shouting force on I'm a Man, the warm, optimistic narrator of Make Me Smile, and the impossibly tender, vulnerable soul on Color My World. His voice, like his guitar playing, was a direct conduit to his emotions, unfiltered and unapologetically human. It was this combination of instrumental genius and vocal authenticity that made him the undeniable soul of the band. The view from the summit of rock and roll stardom is a famously dizzying one. For Chicago, the mid-1970s was a period of seemingly unending triumph. But for Terry Kath, the man who had been the band's initial driving force, the air at this high altitude was becoming thin, toxic. The immense pressures established during their ascent began to exert a crushing gravitational force. The cracks that had formed at the peak of their success widened into chasms, and to cope, Terry turned to the all-too-common palliatives of the rock and roll lifestyle. This was not celebratory indulgence. For Terry, it was a desperate act of self-medication. The rock and roll life, with its endless supply of stimulants and depressants, offered a temporary shield against the anxieties that were consuming him. According to his bandmate and close friend, drummer Danny Serafine, Terry developed an almost superhuman, unnerving tolerance for cocaine. He could take more than anyone I ever knew, Serafine recalled, a statement that speaks not to his strength, but to the depth of his dependency. The core of his identity was that of an artist, a blues purist, a rock and roll warrior. But he was now trapped in the machinery of a pop supergroup. This created a profound cognitive dissonance, a schism in his soul. The drugs and alcohol became a tool to manage this internal conflict. They could, for a time, silence the critical inner voice that told him he was selling out. But the relief was always temporary. He was caught in a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. The artistic compromises fueled the need for chemical escape, and the chemical escape made it harder for him to fight for his artistic vision. He was trying to medicate a wound in his soul, but the medicine was poison. The definitive turning point came in 1976 with the recording of the album Chicago X. The album contained a song that would become the band's biggest ever hit, a ubiquitous global anthem. The song was a silken, string-laden ballad written and sung by Peter Cetera called If You Leave Me Now. It soared to #1 all over the world. It won a Grammy Award. Commercially, it was the band's absolute zenith. For Terry Kath, that #1 hit was not the sound of success, it was the sound of his own ghost watching his band play on without him. It was everything his musical instincts railed against. It was soft, polished, and sentimental. The raw power of the horn section had been neutered. The electric guitar, his voice, was practically absent. This wasn't the rock and roll band with horns he had co-founded in a basement. The phenomenal success of the song was not a cause for celebration. It was a confirmation of his deepest fears. It proved that the path to greater fame lay in abandoning the very blues and rock foundation that he embodied. He felt utterly marginalized, his raw instincts now treated as a quaint relic in the new commercially successful version of his own band. His protest can be heard on the very same album, once or twice. The one true rock song on Chicago X was sung by Terry with a defiant, almost angry snarl. It was a last furious roar of protest from the heart of the machine, but it was a roar that was completely drowned out by the gentle tide of a ballad. His frustration metastasized. The drugs and alcohol, once a crutch, were now a constant companion. In 1977, Chicago released the album Chicago 11. It would be the last album Terry ever recorded. His contributions, like the blistering Mississippi Delta City Blues, felt less like songs and more like desperate last-gasp efforts to seize the controls of a band that was no longer his to steer. It was a losing battle, and he knew it. He began to talk seriously about leaving. His dream was to record a solo album, a project that represented a potential salvation. It was a chance to go back to the beginning, to rediscover the raw, blues-drenched musician he was before the stadiums and the platinum albums. The solo album was his symbolic escape route, a way to reclaim the musical identity that he felt was being erased. The solo album was more than just an idea. It became his great hope, a concrete plan for his artistic rebirth. His vision for the project was a direct rebellion against the slick, string-laden production that had come to define Chicago. He wanted to make a raw, back-to-basics rock and blues record, something that would reconnect him with the visceral energy of his earliest influences. He spoke of a stripped-down band, perhaps a simple trio, where he could stretch out and play with the freedom he no longer felt within the confines of his own group. The project became a tragic subplot in his final years, the dream that never was. The obstacles were immense. The band's relentless schedule left little time for side projects, and the record label, ecstatic with the success of the ballads, likely showed little enthusiasm for a gritty blues album. But perhaps the greatest obstacle was internal. As his substance abuse escalated, his focus fractured, making the immense task of writing and organizing a solo record seem more and more like a distant fantasy. The dream of the solo album thus represents the ultimate tragedy of his final chapter. It wasn't just that he had lost control of his band. He had lost the ability to save himself. While his professional life was a turbulent battleground, Terry was desperately trying to build a sanctuary in his personal life. His marriage to Camelia Ortiz and the birth of their daughter Michelle in 1976 represented a profound anchor in the storm. As detailed in his daughter's documentary, The Terry Kath Experience, the man off stage was a different creature entirely. The roaring guitar hero was replaced by a loving, doting father, a gentle giant who found immense joy in the quiet normalcy of family life. Home video footage reveals a man of warmth and humor, completely at odds with the tormented artist grappling with the machinery of fame. This stark contrast makes his story all the more tragic. He had found the peace he craved, but he could not hold on to it. The pressures of the road and his internal demons would always follow him home. This desperate search for stability was likely haunted by the ghosts of his past. The weight of his first short-lived marriage and the family he had to leave behind to pursue his dream in Los Angeles was an unspoken burden. For a man with a sensitive soul, this lingering sense of guilt, of unfinished business and failed responsibilities, would have added another layer of pressure to a psyche already cracking under the immense weight of his success and artistic disillusionment. Privately, amidst this professional chaos, he was desperately trying to build a foundation of stability. He had married his second wife, Camelia Ortiz, in 1974. Their daughter, Michelle, was born in May of 1976, right as If You Leave Me Now was cementing a new identity for his band. He adored his family. In them, he found a profound, unconditional love that stood in stark contrast to the transactional world of the music business. But the demons were winning. The loving father and husband at home was, in the outside world, a profoundly unhappy and increasingly self-destructive artist, a man tragically divided against himself. He was acutely aware of the precipice on which he was standing. In a moment of chilling clarity, he confessed to Danny Seraphine, "I have to get control of myself, or this thing is going to kill me." It was a shockingly prophetic statement, a cry for help from a man who could see the end of his own road. He knew he was in a fight for his life, and he was running out of time. The fight for Terry Kath's soul was being lost in a haze of artistic frustration and chemical escape. But the final tragic act of his story would not take place in a recording studio or on a stadium stage. It would happen in a quiet room with a familiar piece of steel in a single irreversible moment. Away from the blinding glare of the stage lights, Terry Kath cultivated a passion that was both a reflection of his personality and a dangerous counterpoint to his escalating substance abuse. He was an avid and knowledgeable gun collector. In a life that felt increasingly chaotic and out of his control, his collection of firearms may have represented a tangible, reassuring form of order and power. This hobby, however, when combined with the volatile mixture of cocaine and alcohol that was now a constant in his life, created a fatal synergy. His judgment, once sharp, was now dangerously frayed. The evening of January 23, 1978, began unremarkably. Terry was at the home of Don Johnson, a keyboard technician and roadie for the band. As the night wore on, Terry, in a mood that was both playful and dangerously careless, began to fiddle with his firearms. He first picked up his .38 revolver. In a moment of dark, theatrical bravado, he spun the chamber to show it was empty, put the barrel to his own temple, and pulled the trigger several times. Click, click, click. Then he picked up his 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Johnson, understandably alarmed, urged him to be careful. Terry, seeking to reassure his worried friend, smiled. He was the expert. He was in control. In a fluid motion, he ejected the magazine from the pistol and held it up for Johnson to see. "Don't worry," he said. To emphasize his point, he tapped the side of his head with the pistol. "See? The clip's not in it." Terry Kath's death was a tragic accident, the result of a moment of reckless foolishness. It was not a suicide, but a death by misadventure, the consequence of a fatal mistake when he forgot a round remained in the chamber. With that gunshot, the soul of Chicago was gone. The band was shattered. Although they carried on, for many fans, Chicago became a completely different entity, lacking the fire and gritty soul that Kath had provided. For years, Kath's legacy seemed to fade as Chicago achieved commercial success with the power ballads of the 1980s. But his memory was powerfully rekindled by his own daughter, Michelle Kath Sinclair. Her documentary, The Terry Kath Experience, along with Chicago's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2016, brought the forgotten hero back to his rightful place. Why isn't he ranked alongside Hendrix or Clapton? Perhaps because Kath was a band man whose genius always served the song, not his ego. His passing was not just the loss of solos never played, but the tragedy of a father, a husband, and a brother. Terry Kath's legacy is more than just a cautionary tale. He was the essential bridge between the power of rock and the sophistication of jazz. He was the sound of Chicago itself, the soulful cry of the blues from the South Side, welded to the unforgiving steel of a city that works.